My name is Oilia Palmer. I'm 32 years old, a registered nurse from a small town in Georgia. And the moment my father stood up during Thanksgiving dinner and called me a thief in front of 30 relatives was the moment I realized something terrifying about family. Sometimes the people who raised you are also the people most willing to destroy you. The room went quiet when he said it. "Our daughter stole money from my father," Gerald Palmer announced, standing at the head of the table like he was delivering a verdict instead of passing the gravy. "And we have proof." 30 heads turned toward me at once. My mother was already crying. She always cried early in arguments, the way some people clear their throat before speaking. Her napkin pressed against her eyes, shoulders trembling just enough to make the performance believable. I sat there with my fork still in my hand. Across the table, my cousin Megan stared at me like she was trying to recognize a stranger wearing my face. Uncle Danny slowly set his glass down. Someone at the kids' table whispered, "What did she steal?" My father reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and pulled out a white envelope. He held it between two fingers like evidence in a courtroom. "We didn't want to do this publicly," he continued. But Oilia forced our hand. He walked around the table slowly, deliberately, every step echoing across Aunt Marlene's hardwood floor. When he stopped beside my chair, he placed the envelope in front of me. "This," he said loudly enough for the entire room to hear, "is a court summons. We're suing you for the money you stole from Grandpa Earl." My mother's crying grew louder. Aunt Marlene covered her mouth. Someone muttered, "Oh my God." I looked down at the envelope. Then I looked up at my father, and I smiled. Not because the accusation didn't hurt. It did. But because 4 months earlier, I had quietly hired someone whose entire career revolves around one simple question. Where does money really go when it disappears? And what she found didn't just clear my name. It exposed a lie my parents had been carefully building ever since my grandfather died. But that part of the story didn't start at Thanksgiving. It started 8 months earlier. The week my grandfather, Earl Palmer, was buried. He died on a Tuesday in March. Pneumonia, the doctor said. Quick at the end. Dawson, Georgia isn't a place where deaths go unnoticed. Population somewhere around 4,000, depending on the census year and how many people moved away after high school. It's the kind of town where everyone knows your maiden name, your church, and roughly how much money your family makes. I grew up there. My grandfather raised me almost as much as my parents did. When I was 6, he taught me to read on the wooden porch behind his house. When I was 10, he took me fishing at Lake Blackshear every summer morning before the sun got too hot. When I got accepted into nursing school, he mailed me a birthday card with a $50 check tucked inside. On the memo line, he'd written, "Proud of you, Ophi." That was his nickname for me. But the last 3 years of his life were strange. I called him. He didn't answer. I sent birthday cards. No reply. Christmas letters. Photos from the hospital. Nothing. No returned mail. No messages. Just silence. I told myself he was getting older. Maybe forgetful. Maybe angry about something I'd done and couldn't remember. At the funeral, my father stood at the podium in the front of the chapel, delivering a eulogy that sounded like something rehearsed in front of a mirror. "My father was the greatest man I ever knew," he said, his voice cracking in exactly the right places. People nodded, some wiped tears. I sat 3 rows back. No one asked me to sit with the family. After the service ended, my father gathered a few of us in the hallway. Me, my younger brother Nolan, 2 cousins. He straightened his tie and cleared his throat. "Dad left everything to me," he said. "The house, the savings, all of it." He said it casually, like someone mentioning the weather. Nobody questioned it. I almost didn't either. But something about the way he said it felt wrong. Too smooth, too prepared. Like a line memorized for an audience. Still, I didn't push it. Not then. What I did push was something else. 2 weeks after the funeral, I sat across from my father at his kitchen table and said the words I'd been repeating in my head for years. "Dad, I need my name off that mortgage." 10 years earlier, when I was 22 and fresh out of nursing school, My parents had asked me to co-sign their home loan. "Just 6 months," my father promised. "We'll refinance and remove your name." 6 months became a year. A year became 5. 5 became 10. Every time I asked about refinancing, the same thing happened. My father would get defensive. My mother would cry. And the conversation would end with me feeling like the villain. Meanwhile, my credit score bounced between 580 and 620 because my father sometimes paid the mortgage 30 or 60 days late without telling me. Once I found out at 2 in the morning from a credit monitoring alert. When I called him about it the next day, he just said, "Things were tight. I handled it." He handled it with my name. So 2 weeks after Grandpa Earl's funeral, I tried again. "Dad," I said calmly, "this has been 10 years. I need off that loan." His chair scraped back across the tile. "You want to sue your own parents?" he snapped. I didn't say that. "Well, that's what it sounds like." That night, my mother called half the family. Within 3 days, 4 different relatives had contacted me. "Oilia," Aunt Marlene texted, "your parents raised you, and this is how you repay them?" My cousin Megan left a voicemail. "I heard you're trying to take your parents' house." The story spread fast. According to my father, I was the ungrateful daughter trying to ruin my parents financially right after my grandfather died. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the call I got from my father a few days later. His voice was calm, cold. "You think you're the only one who can play this game?" he said. "What game?" "If you keep pushing," he replied, "people are going to find out what you did with your grandfather's money." I remember sitting in my car outside the hospital after a 12-hour shift, staring at the steering wheel. I hadn't taken a single dollar from my grandfather, but somehow my father had already started convincing people I had. At first, it was whispers. Then it was questions. "Oilia," someone from church asked carefully one Sunday, "did you really take cash from Earl's house?" I felt the ground shifting under my feet. My father wasn't just defending himself. He was building a story. And in a small town like Dawson, once a story takes hold, the truth has to fight twice as hard to catch up. I realized something then. If I stayed quiet, my father's version would become the only version. So that night, I logged into the mortgage account online. Years ago, he had given me the login information so I could keep an eye on things. I started scrolling through the payment history, and that's when I saw it. 3 months before my grandfather died, a home equity withdrawal, $40,000, taken out against the house, using a mortgage with my name on it. Money I had never seen, never approved, never even heard about. I stared at the number for a long time in the empty hospital parking lot. Then I realized something much worse. My father hadn't just trapped me financially. He had gone back to the trap and tightened it. And that was the moment I understood something was very wrong. I sat there with that number burning on my screen. $40,000 pulled out of the house without a word to me. And for the first time, I stopped thinking of my father as careless. Careless misses payments. Careless lies to avoid a hard conversation. This was different. This was deliberate. And once that thought took hold, everything that had felt scattered started lining up into something colder and more organized. The rumors about me didn't spread like outrage. They spread like routine conversation. My father would mention it casually to one relative. My mother would sigh to another. And by the time it came back around to me, it sounded like settled fact. She was over there by herself near the end, wasn't she? That drawer had cash in it. Gerald said money went missing after Earl passed. Nobody came right out and called me a thief to my face at first. They didn't have to. They let the accusation travel for them. My cousin Travis called one evening while I was still in Scrubs. "Hey," he said, trying to sound casual and failing. "Uncle Gerald said some cash disappeared from Grandpa's room. He said you'd been there alone a couple times." I leaned against my kitchen counter so hard my hip hurt. "That's not true." "Okay," he said quickly. "I'm just telling you what I heard." That became the pattern. Not charges. Echoes. A question from one cousin, a strange pause from an aunt, a look that lasted half a second too long at church. The next Sunday at First Baptist, Mrs. Gentry saw me across the fellowship hall, changed direction, and walked toward the coffee table on the other side of the room, without saying a word. That hurt more than if she'd whispered about me. At the hospital, it got worse. One of the nurses on my floor caught me near the medication cart and lowered her voice. "Everything okay at home?" My hands stopped moving. "What do you mean?" She hesitated. "My neighbor mentioned your family. Something legal? Maybe money?" I figured I should ask instead of assuming. I nodded like it was nothing. I finished my shift. I smiled when I had to. I charted vitals, passed meds, checked on patients. But inside, something had gone still. This wasn't just family gossip anymore. My father was laying groundwork. He wasn't defending himself after the fact. He was getting there first, making sure that if the truth ever surfaced, people would already know which story to believe, mine or his. And in Dawson, a father grieving his own father would always get the benefit of the doubt before a daughter asking difficult questions. But he made one mistake. He got too specific. He told people money had gone missing from a dresser drawer. Not a safe, not an account. A dresser drawer. I kept turning that over in my mind. How did he know where Grandpa kept cash unless he'd been in that room, in that drawer, paying close attention? That detail stayed with me until my next day off. Then I drove to the county courthouse in the same scrubs I'd worn overnight because I had gone straight there after work, too tired to change and too angry to care how I looked. The probate clerk sat behind glass with reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. I told her I needed the file for Earl James Palmer's estate. She asked my relation. Granddaughter. She slid the paperwork over without much ceremony. Probate records were public. No confrontation. No permission needed. I took the folder to a bench in the hallway and opened it right there. Inside was the will my father had filed. Typed. Official looking. Clean. It left everything to Gerald Palmer. House, savings, personal property. All of it. I read the page once, then again. Then I looked at the signature. My grandfather's name was at the bottom, but something in me rejected it before I could explain why. I had seen his handwriting too many times over too many years. Birthday cards, notes, check memos, little scraps of paper tucked into books. His hand had a certain rhythm, a certain slant. This signature had the shape of his name, but not the life of it. It looked studied, too careful, like someone had practiced until they got close enough. I pulled out my phone and took a picture. I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't grieving in that moment either. I was alert, sharp. By the time I got back to my car, I already knew my next step. I searched for a forensic accountant before I even started the engine. A few weeks later, right when the town had mostly settled on its opinion of me, my father called. I was at home eating soup at the counter. His name lit up my screen, and for a second, I considered letting it ring out. Instead, I answered. "Thanksgiving at Marlene's," he said. No greeting, no softness. "You'll be there." I swallowed. "I haven't decided." "You don't get to decide." I stared at the wall above my sink. What exactly am I showing up for? A beat. Then, with absolute calm, he said, "To apologize for stealing from my father in front of everyone." The spoon slipped out of my hand and hit the bowl. "I didn't steal anything." "Then come prove it." He disconnected before I could say another word. I stood there listening to silence, my food going cold in front of me. That wasn't an invitation. It was a setup. 20 minutes later, my mother texted. 4 long paragraphs full of the same language she always used when she wanted obedience dressed up as peace. Words like family, healing, closure, not making things worse. The last line was the one that told the truth. "Your father just wants to settle this privately." Privately. In a room packed with relatives. I found out later he'd personally called people who almost never came for Thanksgiving. Distant cousins, older relatives, even people outside the immediate family circle. He didn't want a dinner. He wanted an audience. That night, I lay on my couch staring at the ceiling, weighing two terrible options. Stay home and let him tell the story without me in the room, or walk into it and let him fire the first shot to my face. I thought about my grandfather then, about the 3 years of silence I had tried to explain away. By that point, I knew better. That hadn't been distance. That had been interference. So I texted my father, one word: coming. The next day Nolan called. His voice sounded strained, like he was trying to keep his balance on something narrow. "Mom talked to me," he said. I figured. "She says you took money." I closed my eyes. "Nolan, have you ever seen me take anything from Grandpa?" He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "No." "Have I ever once talked to you about his money?" "No." "She's upset because I pushed Dad about the mortgage. That's what this is." Silence. Nolan lived close enough to our parents to feel the weather of that house more often than I did. He'd watched the same patterns I had, but like everybody else in our family, he had learned early that challenging Gerald came with a price. "They want me standing with them on Thanksgiving," he said quietly. "United Family Front?" "Something like that." "Against me?" He exhaled, but he didn't say no. "I'm not asking you to fight with anybody," I said. "Just pay attention." Another pause. Then he said, "I'll be there. I'm not making a speech." "That's enough." After we hung up, I sat with my phone in my hand a long time. There had been something in his hesitation, not uncertainty exactly, more like pressure, like he had almost said something and stopped himself. I told myself not to read into it. If Nolan had more to say, he'd say it when he was ready. In the meantime, I had my own work to do. Linda Marsh's office was upstairs over a hardware store in a small town south of Dawson. Nothing flashy. A narrow staircase, frosted glass on the door, one potted plant trying its best in a corner. She had gray hair, sharp eyes, and the kind of calm that made me trust her immediately. I gave her everything I had. The probate file, the photo of the signature, the mortgage records, the rumors, the timing. She didn't interrupt much. She took notes, asked precise questions, never once acted shocked. Weeks passed, then months. And 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, I sat across from her again while she laid a bound report on the desk between us. She opened it and turned several pages without drama. "The signature on the filed will," she said, tapping the paper, "does not match your grandfather's verified documents." I looked at her. "You're certain?" "Yes." My throat tightened. She kept going. She had traced the estate assets, savings, property value, account movement. What my father claimed had passed neatly to him had not stayed neat for long. By the time she finished, the number in front of me was so big it almost stopped feeling real. $350,000 had been moved after probate closed. Credit cards, a truck loan, transfers into my mother's account, renovation costs, cash withdrawals that disappeared into open air. I stared at the pages. This wasn't panic spending. This wasn't a man making bad choices under stress. This was a plan. I heard my own voice, distant and flat. So he forged the will and drained the estate. Linda folded her hands. "I can turn this into a formal report," she said. "But once I do, you need to understand something. This stops being suspicion. This becomes a matter of record." I didn't need time to think. "Do it." She gave one small nod. "I'll have it ready in 10 days. 10 days. 3 days before Thanksgiving." I walked out of her office with my pulse pounding so hard it felt like a second heartbeat in my throat. My father thought he was preparing a public humiliation. He had no idea what was coming. I drove home from Linda Marsh's office with a report sitting on the passenger seat, like something radioactive. 3 days before Thanksgiving, she had said. 3 days before the dinner my father was turning into a public trial. For the first time since this whole thing started, I realized something important. Proof didn't automatically mean safety. Proof meant timing, and timing meant strategy. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the report in my mind, the columns of numbers, the neat summary that turned years of suspicion into a documented pattern. But one piece still bothered me, the will. The typed one my father filed clearly wasn't authentic, but that still left one question hanging in the air. Where was the real one? My grandfather wasn't the type to leave something that important undocumented. He was cautious with paperwork, careful with details. So if the will my father filed was fake, then the real one had to exist somewhere. I remembered something small then, a comment my grandfather used to make when we were fishing at Lake Blackshear. "Your great-aunt Ruth has more sense than the rest of us put together." He would say it half joking, half admiring. Ruth Palmer lived about 40 minutes south of Dawson in a quiet neighborhood outside Americus. She hadn't been to a family gathering in almost a decade. No one talked much about why. They just accepted it, which in our family usually meant my father had something to do with it. I found her number in my grandfather's old address book, the one I had taken home after the funeral and left in a box under my bed. I stared at the phone for a long moment before dialing. It rang twice. "Hello?" Her voice sounded older than I expected, but steady. "Mrs. Palmer? This is Oilia, Earl's granddaughter." Silence followed, long enough that I checked the phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then she said quietly, almost to herself, "I wondered how long it would take." My hand tightened around the phone. "What do you mean?" Another pause. "Your grandfather told me you might call one day." Something cold and electric ran down my spine. "He did?" "Yes." Her voice softened slightly. "He gave me something a few years ago and told me to keep it safe. Said if things went wrong after he passed, you'd come looking." My throat felt dry. "What did he give you?" "Come see me," she said. "Saturday morning." The drive to Americus felt longer than 40 minutes. Ruth's house sat back from the road behind 2 old pecan trees. The place looked quiet, almost forgotten. White siding, a small porch, wind chimes that moved lazily in the breeze. She opened the door before I even knocked. She was small, silver-haired, wearing a cardigan that looked older than I was. Her eyes studied my face carefully, the way people do when they're comparing memory with reality. "You look like him," she said finally. I didn't ask which one. She stepped aside and let me in. The house smelled like coffee and old wood. Everything felt orderly, like a place run by someone who valued calm more than appearances. She didn't hug me. She simply walked to the kitchen table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. Then she reached into a drawer and placed an envelope on the table between us. It was yellowed at the edges. My name wasn't on it, neither was anyone else's. "Open it," she said. My fingers felt clumsy as I slid the paper out. The moment I saw the handwriting, my chest tightened. It was unmistakably my grandfather's. Not typed. Not polished. Just a shaky, handwritten document signed and dated years earlier. 2 neighbors' signatures appeared at the bottom as witnesses. I read the first paragraph, then the second. My vision blurred halfway through the page. Everything he owned, his house, his savings, was divided equally between 4 people. Me, my brother Nolan, my cousins Travis and Megan, not my father. The room felt very quiet. I looked up slowly. "This is real," I said. Ruth nodded. "He wrote it 5 years ago." "Why didn't anyone know about it?" Her mouth tightened slightly. "Because Gerald visited him every week those last few years." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" She folded her hands together. "He told Earl you didn't want contact anymore." For a second, I didn't understand the sentence. Then the meaning hit all at once. "He told Grandpa I stopped calling?" "Yes." "He told him I didn't want to see him?" Yes. I felt something sharp twist inside my chest. My grandfather stopped answering my calls, I said slowly. I thought he was angry with me. Ruth shook her head. He wasn't. The kitchen clock ticked quietly on the wall. Your father controlled what reached him. Phone calls, letters, messages. Earl believed you had moved on with your life. I pressed my hand against the table to steady myself. 3 years. 3 years of silence that hadn't been silence at all. It had been interference. Ruth watched me carefully. He suspected something wasn't right near the end, she added. That's why he asked me to keep the will. I nodded slowly. Thank you for telling me. She gave a small sigh. Your grandfather loved you very much, Oilia. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. I left her house carrying the envelope like it was something fragile. And now the picture was clearer. My father hadn't just taken the money. He had rewritten the entire story. But there was still something else that changed everything. It happened 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. I was sitting on my couch when Nolan called. His voice sounded different this time. Lower. Quieter. Can you talk? He asked. Of course. I need to tell you something, but you can't ask how I know. My stomach tightened. Okay. He inhaled slowly. 2 months ago, I went by the house to grab my drill from the garage. Yeah? I came through the side door. Mom and Dad were in the kitchen. They didn't hear me. I sat up straighter. What were they saying? He hesitated. Then he spoke very carefully. Dad said, she can't prove anything. The will is filed. It's done. My heart slammed against my ribs, and Mom asked what happens if you get a lawyer. What did he say? Nolan's voice dropped even further. He said then we go louder. I closed my eyes. Louder? He said they'd make you the villain, that no one would believe you over them. The room felt suddenly smaller. Nolan, he interrupted. I recorded it. My eyes snapped open. You what? I hit record on my phone when I realized what they were talking about. My voice came out almost as a whisper. You still have it? Yes. A second later, my phone buzzed. The audio file arrived. I pressed play. The sound quality was rough, muffled through walls and distance, but the voices were unmistakable. My father's voice. My mother's voice. Every word Nolan described was there. The recording ended. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Finally, I asked, why didn't you tell me sooner? Nolan didn't answer immediately. Then he said quietly, because they're my parents, too. I understood that. Fear doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like carrying evidence in your pocket for 2 months because you don't know what happens when you release it. Thank you, I said. What are you going to do with it? I'm not sure yet. But I did know one thing. I'm not walking into Thanksgiving empty-handed. A few days later, I met with an estate attorney named Harlan Bates in Albany. His office had wood panel walls and a framed diploma from the University of Georgia behind his desk. I laid everything out. Linda's forensic report, the handwritten will, the probate file, the recording Nolan made. He read silently for nearly 40 minutes, then he leaned back in his chair. This is fraud, he said plainly. My pulse quickened. Clear fraud, he continued. Forgery, estate misappropriation, and falsified probate filings. What happens now? You could challenge the will, possibly trigger criminal charges depending on how the district attorney views it. I shook my head. Not yet. He studied me. Then what exactly do you want? My father is planning something at Thanksgiving, I said. I don't know exactly what, but I know he won't keep it quiet. The lawyer nodded slowly. You want to be prepared. Yes. He assembled a packet containing the evidence summary, copies of financial records, and documentation about the original will. Then he sealed everything inside a large manila envelope. He slid it across the desk toward me. "If you ever need this," he said, "it speaks for itself." I picked it up. The weight felt heavier than paper. That evening, I called Ruth again. "Would you come to Thanksgiving?" I asked. Silence. "I haven't attended a family dinner in 9 years," she said finally. "I know." Another pause. Then she said softly, "For Earl, I'll come." After the call ended, I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the envelope resting beside my bag. If my father said nothing at Thanksgiving, I wouldn't need to open it. But that possibility lasted about 3 seconds. I knew my father. Silence had never been his style. 3 days later, Thanksgiving morning arrived. By the time I pulled into Aunt Marlene's driveway, the house was already full of cars. Voices drifted through the open front door. Inside, 3 long tables had been pushed together down the center of the living room. More than 30 place settings. More people than usual. Exactly what my father wanted. When I stepped through the doorway, conversation slowed. Not dramatically, just enough for me to feel it. Eyes moved, whispers started. Everyone there had already heard some version of the story, and they were waiting to see how it ended. I set my bag under the chair and felt the envelope inside press lightly against my ankle. Across the table, my father watched me with a small, satisfied smile, the kind of smile people wear when they believe the ending has already been written. 20 minutes later, he tapped his knife against a glass. The entire room fell silent. He stood slowly, and I knew the show had officially begun. The sound of the knife tapping the glass echoed through the room. Every conversation stopped. My father stood at the head of the table like he was about to give a speech at a wedding, instead of dismantling his daughter in front of half the family. "Before we go around and say what we're thankful for," he began calmly, "there's something we need to address." His eyes moved slowly across the table until they landed on me. My mother dabbed her eyes with a napkin before he even finished the sentence. Perfect timing. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably. Someone near the end of the table set their fork down quietly. Most of them already knew what was coming. They had heard the whispers. Now they were about to see the performance. My father continued, his voice heavy with practiced disappointment. "After my father passed, we discovered money missing from his accounts." He paused just long enough for the room to tighten. "We investigated." His gaze settled on me again. "And the evidence points to one person." 30 pairs of eyes turned. "Our daughter," he said clearly, "took it." A collective breath moved through the room. Someone whispered, "Jesus." My mother's shoulders started shaking again. I didn't move. I sat there with my hands resting on the table and watched my father the way a nurse watches a monitor during surgery, calm on the outside, analyzing every change. He reached inside his blazer and pulled out a white envelope. Then he walked around the table. Slow, deliberate. The room was silent except for the sound of his shoes on the hardwood floor. When he reached my chair, he placed the envelope in front of me. "We've already taken legal steps," he announced. "This is a court summons demanding repayment of what you stole." Gasps spread down the table. Uncle Danny leaned forward. "If you need a lawyer, Gerald, I know someone in Albany." My father raised a hand slightly without looking at him. His attention stayed on me. "Go ahead," he said. "Open it." I picked up the envelope. It felt light. Too light. Inside was a printed document designed to look official. At first glance, it almost worked. But I had spent weeks sitting across from a real attorney. Real legal paperwork has weight to it. Clerk stamps, filing numbers, specific formatting. This one had none of that. Just clean type on standard printer paper. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was a prop. My father had staged a courtroom without a judge. I slid the document back into the envelope and placed it beside my plate. My father folded his arms, waiting. He expected panic, denial, maybe tears. What he got instead was me standing slowly from my chair. The room seemed to tilt toward me as I pushed the chair back. Even the kids at the folding table had gone quiet. I want everyone here to remember something, I said calmly. I didn't start this. My father smirked, then explained the money. I ignored the comment and looked straight at him. Before I say anything else, I have one question. He lifted his chin. Did Grandpa write the will you filed in probate? Of course he did. You're certain? His eyes hardened. Are you calling me a liar in front of this entire family? I didn't answer. Instead, I bent down and reached under my chair. My fingers found the bag at my feet. Inside it was the manila envelope. Thick, sealed. 4 months of quiet work inside a few sheets of paper. I placed it on the table next to the fake summons. The difference between the two envelopes was obvious. One thin, one heavy. My father's expression flickered for the first time, just for a second. What's that? He asked. I met his eyes. Evidence. The words settled into the room like dust. I broke the seal. My mother stopped crying. 32 people leaned forward slightly as I pulled out the first document. This, I said, holding the page up, is a comparison between the signature on the will my father filed and 17 verified signatures from my grandfather. I passed the sheet to Aunt Marlene. She adjusted her glasses and stared down at it. The 2 columns showed the same name written again and again, but the differences were obvious once you look closely. My grandfather's writing leaned slightly to the left. The letters stretched naturally. The filed signature looked stiff, careful, practiced. Marlene's lips parted slightly. She handed the paper to Uncle Danny without saying anything. A forensic accountant examined these, I continued evenly. Her conclusion is that the probate signature isn't authentic. That's ridiculous, my father snapped. You paid someone to say that. I shrugged slightly. You don't have to believe me. Uncle Danny held the page closer to the light. Then he frowned. Travis studied it for several seconds before sliding it down the table. People began comparing the samples silently. The room shifted. Not loudly, but unmistakably. Confusion first, then something heavier. My mother hadn't moved in several minutes. She was staring at my father now instead of crying. I reached back into the envelope and pulled out the second document. This, I said quietly, is my grandfather's actual will. The paper looked older, creased from years of storage. I read the key line aloud. My estate is to be divided equally among my 4 grandchildren. I said their names. Mine. Nolan's, Travis's, Megan's, not Gerald Palmer. My father stepped back slightly. That's fake. Before I could answer, a chair scraped at the far end of the table. Everyone turned. A small woman with silver hair was standing. Aunt Ruth. She had been sitting quietly the entire evening, almost forgotten. Now every eye in the room focused on her. He gave that to me, she said calmly. My father's voice sharpened. Ruth, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm not finished. She didn't raise her voice, but the room went silent anyway. 3 years ago, Earl brought that envelope to my kitchen table. He told me to keep it safe because he didn't trust his own son. A ripple moved through the room. My father's face went pale. Ruth looked directly at him. You visited him every week near the end, she continued, and you told him Oilia didn't want contact anymore. My chest tightened. Ruth turned toward me. He believed you had abandoned him. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The silence wasn't confusion anymore. It was realization. My father opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I pulled the final document from the envelope. After probate closed, I said steadily, $350,000 was withdrawn from my grandfather's accounts. The paper showed the transactions. I read them out loud. Credit cards, truck loan, transfers, renovations, cash withdrawals. Each number landed like a hammer. That money belonged to 4 grandchildren, I finished. My father grabbed the back of his chair. It was mine. No, I said. It wasn't. Someone pushed their chair back slowly near the end of the table. Another relative looked down at their plate. Uncle Danny finally turned toward my father. "Gerald," he said carefully, "is this true?" My father looked around the room, searching for support, for someone still standing beside him. He found no one. "She's manipulating you," he said hoarsely. "These documents are fabricated." "Then explain the money," I replied. He opened his mouth again. Nothing came. That's when Nolan stood up. Every head turned toward him. He was holding his phone. "I heard them," he said quietly. My father's head snapped toward him. "Nolan." 2 months ago, Nolan continued, I came into the house through the garage. Mom and Dad were in the kitchen. They didn't know I was there. He placed the phone on the table. I recorded the conversation. My father went completely still. Nolan pressed play. Through the phone speaker, my father's voice filled the room. "She can't prove anything. The will is filed. It's done." Then my mother's voice. "What if she hires a lawyer?" And my father again. Then we go louder. We make her the villain. The recording ended. No one spoke. The silence that followed felt heavier than any shouting could have been. My father slowly sat down in his chair, like something inside him had just collapsed. My mother whispered, almost to herself, "I told you this would happen." And that was the moment the entire room understood. For a few seconds after the recording ended, nobody moved. My father sat there staring at the table as if the wood grain might somehow offer him an escape route. My mother's face had gone flat and pale, the tears gone now, the performance stripped off her all at once. I didn't feel triumphant. That's the part people always imagine wrong in stories like this. They think the truth lands and suddenly you feel powerful. I didn't. I felt emptied out. Because this wasn't some stranger being exposed in a courtroom. This was my family's Thanksgiving table. These were people whose birthdays I knew, whose kids I had held as babies, whose casseroles I'd eaten for years. And now every person in that room had just watched the center of our family split open. No one asked for pie. No one even looked toward the kitchen. People began leaving in layers. First, the relatives who had only come because my father invited them to witness my humiliation. Then the cousins, then the uncles. Coats were pulled off hooks, chairs scraped. Quiet goodbyes passed over my parents entirely. A few people stopped near me on their way out. Travis gripped my hand on the porch and said, "Call me this week." Megan caught me near the driveway while people were backing cars out. "If that handwritten will holds up," she said, voice tight, "then the 4 of us were all cheated." "I know." She looked back toward the house, jaw set. "I want whatever report you have." "I'll send it." And I did. Within the week, Travis and Megan had their own attorney. They filed to reopen my grandfather's estate based on the forged signature and the earlier valid will. That part mattered to me in a way I can't fully explain. I didn't drag them into it. I handed them the truth, and they chose what to do with it themselves. That made a difference. It meant this wasn't revenge. It was correction. Their attorney also reviewed the fake summons my father had slid across the Thanksgiving table like he was detonating a bomb. It wasn't filed with any court, no case number, no clerk's seal, nothing official anywhere in Georgia. Just printer paper in an envelope. A prop. When the lawyer explained that to me, I actually laughed once. Not because it was funny, but because I had spent so much of my life being intimidated by my father's confidence that seeing the mechanics underneath it felt almost surreal. He had tried to frighten me into silence with something that had no legal force at all. Meanwhile, the real paperwork was in my bag the whole time. A little over a week after Thanksgiving, Harlan Bates sent a certified letter to my father demanding that he refinance the mortgage and remove my name within 60 days. The letter also referenced the $40,000 equity withdrawal he had taken against the house without my knowledge. This time, the threat was real, and my father knew it. He was already staring down a reopened estate dispute, possible fraud exposure, and the collapse of his reputation in the one town where image had always mattered most to him. He didn't fight. 5 weeks later, I was sitting in the hospital break room, halfway through a granola bar, when my phone buzzed with a bank notification. I opened the email, read it once, then again. My name had been removed from the mortgage, effective immediately. I just sat there. A coworker walked by, looked at my face and asked, "You okay?" I nodded because I couldn't speak. Then I took my keys, walked out to the parking lot, got into my car, and shut the door. I cried there with both hands over my mouth. Not because everything was fixed, not because I was happy, because something heavy had finally been lifted and I hadn't realized how much of my body had been bracing under it for 10 years. 10 years of waiting for refinancing conversations that never went anywhere. 10 years of watching my credit get wrecked by someone else's missed payments. 10 years of being financially tied to a man who used obligation like a leash. And then suddenly, gone. Not erased. The damage had happened. But the chain was off. I checked my credit not long after. It had already started climbing. It wasn't perfect, but for the first time in a decade, it belonged to me again. A week before Christmas, Aunt Ruth called. "Come by Saturday," she said. "I have something of Earl's for you." The sky was gray when I drove to her house. Her kitchen smelled like cedar and coffee, and there was a shoebox sitting on the table when I walked in. She slid it toward me. "He wanted you to have these." Inside were letters, 11 of them. I picked up the first one carefully, already recognizing my grandfather's hand before I unfolded the page. They had been written over the last 3 years of his life. Some only a few paragraphs, some longer. All addressed to me, but not sent to me, sent to Ruth for safekeeping. I sat down hard in the kitchen chair and opened the first one. He wrote that my father had told him I no longer wanted contact. He wrote that he didn't believe it, but if it were true, he wanted me to know he loved me anyway. My vision blurred. I opened another. Then the last one, written just 2 months before he died. In it, he said plainly that he intended for what he owned to go to the 4 grandchildren. He told me that if anything happened and things didn't line up, Ruth would have what I needed. I set the page down and pressed both palms flat against the kitchen table because the room had started to tilt. For 3 years, I had thought my grandfather stopped caring. For 3 years, I had wondered what I'd done wrong. And all that time he had been writing to me, trying to reach me any way he could, while my father made sure I never knew. Ruth poured coffee and left me alone with the letters for a while. That was kindness too. Not the loud kind, the useful kind. By early December, everyone in Dawson knew. Not because I made announcements, not because I posted anything, because 32 people had sat in that living room and watched the truth rearrange itself in real time. In a town like ours, that was more than enough. My parents stopped getting invited places. Church conversations shortened around them. Holiday gatherings happened without their names on the list. No one made a scene. No one publicly exiled them. That's not how small towns punish you. They simply recalculate your place. Mrs. Gentry, the same woman who had avoided me months earlier, stopped me in a grocery store parking lot one Saturday and touched my arm. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I believed the wrong person." I told her I understood, and I did. That may sound strange, but I knew how my father worked. He built certainty first and facts later. People trusted the role he played. It wasn't stupidity. It was conditioning. The probate court accepted the petition to reopen my grandfather's estate in January. Things moved faster than I expected after that. The judge reviewed the forensic findings, the handwritten will, the witness statements, and the account records. An independent handwriting expert was brought in and reached the same conclusion Linda had. The signature my father filed was not my grandfather's. From there, consequences split in 2 directions, civil and criminal. The estate had to be redistributed according to what my grandfather had actually intended. After fees and liquidation, each of the 4 grandchildren received around $82,000. Travis paid off his truck. Megan put the money toward her daughter's future. Nolan held on to his share while he thought things through. I left mine sitting untouched in savings for a while. I needed time before I could spend any of it without feeling the stain of the fight attached to it. It wasn't revenge money. It was inheritance that had finally been returned to its proper path. The week after Thanksgiving, Nolan called me. Not because of our parents. Not because he needed something. Just to talk. That alone felt new. He apologized for waiting as long as he had with the recording. "You told me when it mattered," I said. And I meant that. After that, we started meeting on Sunday mornings at a diner off Route 19. Cracked vinyl booths, bad coffee. The kind of place where nobody rushed you out. At first, we talked about work, weather, nothing important. Then slowly, we started comparing notes on our childhood. Turns out my father had tried to get Nolan to co-sign a personal loan a couple years earlier. Nolan refused. My father barely spoke to him for 4 months afterward. Punishment. Distance as discipline. Once we began talking honestly, it became impossible not to see the pattern. He had kept us separated on purpose. Different stories for different children. Different pressure points. Different silences. We had spent years thinking we were alone inside something that had actually been happening to both of us. One Sunday, after a long stretch of quiet over coffee, Nolan looked down at the table and said, "He played us against each other our whole lives." I looked at him and said, "I know." And I did. We sat there for a while after that without speaking. It was the most peaceful silence I'd had in years. But the story still wasn't done with me yet. 2 months after Thanksgiving, my phone rang at 8 in the morning. It was my mother. "Our daughter is a thief." That's how this story began. Those were the words my father chose to say in front of 30 relatives at a Thanksgiving table covered in turkey, casseroles, and people who thought they knew me. For a long time, I thought that moment was the worst part of everything that happened. It wasn't. The worst part had happened years earlier, quietly, slowly, when I let someone else decide how much of my life I was allowed to control. That was the part I didn't understand until much later. 2 months after that Thanksgiving dinner, my phone rang early one morning. It was my mother. She almost never called before 10, so I answered. Her voice sounded different, flat, quiet, like the energy had drained out of it. "I know you won't forgive us," she said. Not hello, not how are you, just that. I leaned against my kitchen counter and looked out the window while she spoke. "I didn't want things to go this far," she continued. I thought about the calls she made to relatives, the rumors she helped spread, the tears at the table. "You let it happen," I said. She didn't argue. "You're right." There was a long pause. Finally, she said something honest, maybe for the first time in years. "I was afraid of losing the house." It wasn't a good excuse, but it was a real one. Fear makes people smaller. I had watched it shape my mother's life for decades. "I need space," I told her. "A lot of it." She said okay. No crying, no guilt, just quiet acceptance. After that call ended, I never heard from my father. No message, no apology, no attempt to explain. For a man who had spent his entire life controlling the narrative, silence was the only move he had left. And eventually, I stopped waiting for anything else. 4 months after Thanksgiving, I bought a house. Nothing impressive, 900 square feet, 2 bedrooms, white siding and a green front door. The porch is barely big enough for 2 chairs, but it catches the evening sun just right. I used the inheritance money as the down payment and qualified for the rest myself. When the loan officer handed me the paperwork, he shook my hand and said something simple. No cosigner. Just my name. The first night I slept there, the house was almost empty. No couch, no curtains. Just a mattress on the floor and a pizza box on the kitchen counter. I sat on the living room floor, eating cold slices and listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Then I hung one thing on the wall above the fireplace. A photo of my grandfather standing by the lake with a fishing rod in one hand and the biggest grin you could imagine. I stepped back and looked at it. "Not bad, Grandpa," I said to the empty room. The next morning I went to work like any other day. Same scrubs, same hospital parking lot. But something had shifted inside me. The math of my life finally made sense. The mortgage payment belonged to me. The house belonged to me. The decisions belonged to me. Every Saturday, I drive down to Americus to visit Aunt Ruth. She makes coffee. I bring cake from the bakery on Main Street. We sit at her kitchen table and talk about my grandfather, the real version of him, not the edited one my father tried to sell everyone. She shows me old photographs sometimes. Earl at 20 in an army uniform. Earl at 50, building the house with his own hands. Earl laughing with a fish nearly as big as the cooler beside him. My place is small, but every inch of it is peaceful. Sometimes Nolan comes over on Sundays. We paint a room, or fix something small, or just sit on the porch drinking coffee without talking much. For years, we thought we had lost our parents that Thanksgiving. The truth is, we lost them long before that. What we found instead was each other. The photograph Ruth sent me last week is taped to my refrigerator. It shows my grandfather holding me when I was about 3 years old at a 4th of July picnic. I'm gripping a sparkler with both fists. He's laughing so hard his eyes are nearly closed. On the back, he wrote a short message. Ophi, Grandpa's proud of you. My father tried to rewrite my grandfather's story. He forged signatures. He took money that wasn't his. He nearly convinced an entire town that I was the villain. But the truth has a strange way of surviving. Sometimes it hides in letters. Sometimes it waits in someone else's drawer. Sometimes it shows up at a Thanksgiving table when the right person finally refuses to stay quiet. Here's what I learned from all of it. Love isn't proven by how much you endure. It's proven by how clearly you protect what matters. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do for yourself is close a door that should have been closed a long time ago and build a new one somewhere else. I didn't win a war. I just stopped being someone else's casualty. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting your dignity, I'd love to hear your story too. What would you have done at that Thanksgiving table? Tell me in the comments.